There is nothing so miraculous, so absolutely unique as a newborn baby. No one would ever guess that humans share 99.9% of their genetic code with every other person on the planet. In those genes lie clues to genetic vulnerabilities and mutations associated with many of the leading causes of death in the United States. Today, scientists have discovered a new class of genetic mutations linked to an array of neurological and reproductive conditions and disorders. This mutation exists in all ethnicities and populations throughout the world. Its name, Fragile X.
We know that Fragile X has no racial or ethnic bounds or cultural bounds. It's a worldwide condition. It impacts everybody. Fragile X is heritable, meaning it gets passed down from generation to generation, or it has what some people like to call a cascade effect.
In 1943, genetic research identified an association between children with developmental delays associated with the X chromosome. In 1991, the Fragile X gene was discovered, ushering in a period of rapid advancement in understanding the disorder now called Fragile X syndrome. The study of Fragile X syndrome and related conditions and disorders are a focus of study at the Mind Institute at the University of California, Davis.
The University of California Davis Mind Institute is an internationally recognized research, clinical care, and educational center focused on neurodevelopmental disabilities such as autism and Fragile X syndrome. Fragile X syndrome became a major focus of the Mind Institute in the early 2000s with the arrival of doctors Rondi and Paul Hagerman, who really are the leading experts in the world on the diagnosis, understanding, and treatment of Fragile X syndrome and related conditions.
Fragile X disorders, including Fragile X syndrome related to the full mutation and also pre-mutation or carrier disorders, occur all over the world. And the features of Fragile X syndrome include hyperactivity, impulsivity, poor eye contact, hand flapping, hand biting, and very severe anxiety, in addition to their intellectual disability.
So the majority of all people with Fragile X syndrome also have autism or are on the autism spectrum. In fact, about 5% of all individuals with autism actually have a mutation in the Fragile X gene, making it the most common single gene form of autism.
There are over 2 million people in the world who have Fragile X syndrome. The vast majority of carriers who pass on the full mutation are completely unaware they have a 50% risk that each pregnancy will result in a child with Fragile X syndrome.
Fragile X has impacted our family. I'm a Fragile X carrier, and we didn't even know Fragile X was in our family until our son was born, and he's mentally impaired. And it was devastating at first because it was something we couldn't fix with a pair of glasses or hearing aids. It was going to be hard for him to learn his ABCs, his numbers, basic colors. So we learned to accept the diagnosis and actually become his cheerleader, an advocate for his special education. But it was hard. It's a mean gene that impacts a family in the worst way.
But Fragile X syndrome is by no means the entire story. Research over the last 30 years has revealed that as many as 1 in 300 to 400 people worldwide have smaller expansion of the Fragile X mutation and are known as Fragile X carriers. Carriers don't have enough mutation to cause Fragile X syndrome, but they are at high risk for developing other neurological and reproductive pre-mutation conditions and disorders. And most have no idea they are vulnerable.
Many people, both men and women, are carriers, but they don't know it. Carrier frequency is much higher than anyone ever realized. And the prevalence of the pre-mutation is extremely and surprisingly high.
Among the pre-mutation carriers, The at-risk population is much higher. It's anywhere between 1 in 300, 1 in 400 in the general population. Not all of these individuals will get it, but this tells you who's at higher risk for developing one or more of these pre-mutation-associated conditions. And worldwide, the at-risk population is about 40 million. And that's not a small number.
One of the most devastating of the pre-mutation disorders is FAXTAS, and that stands for Fragile X Associated Tremor Ataxia Syndrome. This usually starts in the 60s, sometimes earlier, and it starts with tremor and then balance problems. It also has cognitive deficits, memory problems, eventually cognitive decline and dementia, particularly in males. And eventually individuals are unable to walk and become bedridden, and then they die.
My brother's name is Stephen, and he is 2 years older than I am. We used to tell people we were twins. About 10 years ago, Stephen started having symptoms that looked like an imbalance. And normally he had a real good gait, but all of a sudden he couldn't even walk on the beach without falling. And he was in banking, and all of a sudden he was having challenges with numbers. And we heard about a Fragile X family-related disorder called FAXTAS. And we took him to the Mind Institute for a study, and he was diagnosed with Fragile X tremor ataxia syndrome. It's been a challenging 10 years. He now has 24/7 care.
Unfortunately, FAXTAS is often misdiagnosed as one of the other major neurodegenerative disorders, such as Alzheimer's disorder or Parkinson's disorder. And this presents two problems. One is the right diagnosis is not being made. And secondly, people are treated inappropriately because they're being treated for a disorder they don't have.
Another premutation disorder is known as FAXPOI, Fragile X-associated premature ovarian insufficiency. This causes early menopause as early as the teen years, severe bone thinning, loss of skin elasticity, signs of premature aging, and in most cases, infertility.
It happens to girls anywhere from their late teens to their late 30s. It looks like early menopause. Our daughter was in college and had to come home. She just kept saying, "I don't feel like myself." She had hot flashes, which now we know was menopausal, but who's expecting to have early menopause when you're 18? And it wasn't until she was invited in a rare disease study at the NIH that she was diagnosed with FXPOI.
It is devastating for these women to know that their ovaries don't work, that they won't be able to have children, and also there's a lot of emotional overlay that happens when you are infertile. FAXPOI is the most common genetic disorder leading to early ovarian failure, and OBGYN doctors need to routinely test for the Fragile X gene mutation in any woman who presents with ovarian dysfunction or early ovarian failure, or even infertility.
Because FAXPOI is so obscure, very few gynecologists, endocrinologists, certainly not regular internists and family practitioners will think to screen for it.
Hormone therapy can help with some of the emotional difficulties. You can't reverse ovarian failure.
The most common premutation problem comes under the term FAXAND, which stands for Fragile X-associated neuropsychiatric disorders.
Neuropsychiatric disorders include depression, anxiety, phobias, ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, and a whole host of conditions that can be life-defining and catastrophic in people's lives.
Fragile X full mutation resulting in Fragile X syndrome, and premutations leading to FAXTAS, FAXPOI, and FAXAND are in dire need of further study. At the Mind Institute at UC Davis, a research and development plan is addressing 5 urgent areas of study requiring immediate financial support.
So faced with the problems associated with this Fragile X gene, research in this area is a very expensive proposition.
There is just not enough money to develop better and better treatments for pre-mutation disorders. In a 5-year plan with significant funding, we would look initially at repurposing existing drugs for treatment of FAXTAS and maybe even Fragile X syndrome. Another priority in our plan is developing new targeted treatments for both FAXTAS and Fragile X syndrome, and even FAXPOI and FAXAND.
Educational component to get out there and get the word out to physicians and the general public as well. Another important component with Fragile X research is gathering data. How many people have this disorder? How many people are carriers? From the molecular perspective, what are the targets that we can use then for gene engineering type approaches to treat these disorders?
We have passionate families who are fierce advocates for their individuals and their lives that live with Fragile X. We have the talented researchers and clinicians who have dedicated their careers to this incredible community. But what we don't have is enough funding to make real change and create real momentum for these individuals living with Fragile X.
Now is the time to invest in research on Fragile X syndrome and the premutation conditions. We have learned so much so fast. We really are on the verge of transformative discoveries that are going to change the lives of people, not just in the United States, but really all over the world.
You can help support identification of medicinal and gene therapies that can advance the correction of Fragile X mutations and premutations throughout the world. To support efforts to combat Fragile X and Fragile X-related disorders, contact the Mind Institute at the University of California, Davis.